For tens of thousands of years, we've been told the same story about our past. That human life was a constant struggle, an exhausting fight against hunger, cold, and danger. We imagine our ancestors huddled in the shadows, always alert, always afraid, focused on one simple task, surviving one more day. But when archaeologists began looking closely at the evidence, a very different picture started to appear. The people who lived long before clocks, offices, and schedules didn't spend most of their lives working. In fact, they often worked far fewer hours than we do today. Step back 40,000 years. There is no alarm pulling you out of sleep, no deadline waiting, no sense of being late. You wake on a bed of furs as cool morning air moves through the shelter. You're not rushing anywhere. A few hours of the day might be spent gathering roots or tracking animals, but much of your time passes slowly, mending tools, sharing food by the fire, or simply watching clouds drift across an open sky. History often tells us that civilization freed us from nature's hardships, but it's worth pausing here for a moment. What if the pressure to always be busy came later? What if the people we call primitive lived with more time, not less? If our ancestors weren't constantly struggling just to survive, what were they actually doing with all those quiet hours? And when life began to speed up, what did we leave behind without even noticing? By the end of this video, you will understand the mechanics of the original affluent society and how the human brain evolved not for constant busyness, but for a life of deep leisure and social connection. If you're using this to fall asleep, perfect. That's exactly why I make these videos. So maybe hit subscribe and definitely tell me in the comments where you are and what time it is right now. I love checking and seeing like Tokyo at sunrise, London at lunch, Los Angeles at midnight, all watching together. It's kind of beautiful when you think about it. If our ancestors were not locked in a constant struggle just to stay alive, how did they actually spend the long hours of their days? When morning arrived in a prehistoric camp, what did it really bring with it? How did the image of the starving, fearful cave dweller become so fixed in the modern imagination? If finding food only took a small part of the daylight, what filled the rest of the time? When a small group gathered around a hearth for hours, what were they doing together? Were they simply waiting for hunger to return, or were those quiet stretches spent telling stories, making objects, teaching children, and watching the world around them? We can see the marks of effort, grit worn into ancient teeth, stone tools smoothed by years of use. But we also find shells carried far from the sea, shaped carefully into beads that served no immediate purpose for survival. These objects survived in the ground. The long hours between them did not. Those unhurried hours, when nothing was hunted, nothing was gathered, and nothing was built, rarely leave traces behind, and yet they may have shaped human life more than any moment of hard labour. Long before fields were planted or time was measured, human days followed a slower rhythm. To understand that rhythm, we have to look not just at what people did, but at how they spent the time in between. To understand where this slower rhythm began to fade, we don't need to start with the first cities or the age of monuments. Instead, we move much farther back, into the long stretch of time when most human lives were lived without schedules, without fields to tend, and without hours measured by anything other than light. Our journey begins by setting aside the familiar image of the starving caveman. From there, we step into a single morning in the late Paleolithic, watching a way of life that moved without urgency or deadlines. We then travel through the landscapes where people found food without farming, walking with them as they gathered and resting with them beside the fire, where stories were shared and simple objects were shaped by hand. Finally, we approached the moment when this balance began to change, not suddenly, but slowly, as days became more crowded and time itself began to feel different. This journey stretches across tens of thousands of years and touches many places, but it follows one simple thread. Before we take the first step, we can pause here for a moment. It is perfectly natural to let these questions drift in the background as you listen. Whether you're focused on the details or simply resting, the story remains the same. We now move back to the beginning, before the concept of a working day even existed. Imagine standing on a high limestone ridge, looking down into a broad green valley as the first light of morning begins to break through a thick layer of mist. The air is cold and carries the scent of damp earth, pine needles, and the faint lingering smell of wood smoke from a small fire below. Roughly 30,000 years ago, this landscape in what is now southwestern France was not a wilderness of terror, but a home. Tens of thousands of years before the first cities were ever imagined, the rhythm of human existence was already firmly established here, and it followed a pace that is almost unrecognizable to the modern mind. This is the story of how our earliest ancestors actually lived their daily lives, far from the modern cycle of constant work and artificial schedules. As we descend into the valley, the grey light begins to reveal the entrance of a shallow rock shelter. The ground is covered in a soft layer of dry grass and animal skins. Inside, a small group of 20 or 30 people is beginning to stir. There is no sudden alarm, no urgent sense that the day must be seized or conquered. Instead, the transition from sleep to wakefulness is slow. A person sits up, pulling a heavy reindeer hide closer to their shoulders. Another reaches out to stoke the embers of a fire that has been kept burning through the night. Their movements are practiced and calm, repeated thousands of times over thousands of generations. This is where the image of the prehistoric past begins to change. For a long time, we have been told that these people lived in a state of perpetual crisis, that every waking hour was a desperate struggle to find food before they starved. However, the evidence found in these ancient living spaces tells a different story. What we know from the archaeological remains is that these groups were not constantly on the move, driven by hunger. Instead, they occupied these shelters for long periods, creating a stable, predictable environment. We can see this in the deep layers of ash in the hearths and the way the floor space was carefully organised for different activities. The group gathers around the central fire. There is a communal sharing of food, perhaps some dried meat or a handful of starchy roots gathered the day before. There is a sense of ease in the way they interact. They speak in low tones, their voices blending with the crackle of the wood and the distant sound of the river at the bottom of the valley. A child plays with a small, smooth pebble, rolling it back and forth on a flat stone. Near the edge of the sleeping area, someone picks up a piece of ivory. It has been carved into the shape of a small bird, polished until it glows softly in the firelight. This object has no function for hunting. It does not help catch fish or skin an animal. It exists simply because someone had the time, the skill, and the desire to create it. We can imagine the hands that held this carving, the hours spent carefully etched into its surface. This is the kind of trace history leaves behind when survival is not the only thing on the mind. In the corner of the shelter, propped against the stone wall, is a large spear thrower made of antler. It is a highly effective tool, but it sits idle. The group is not preparing for a massive, exhausting hunt today. In fact, most of the people in the shelter will not leave the immediate area for several hours. Some will stay behind to tend the fire, others to work on clothing, and some simply to rest. What we can observe from modern studies of similar hunter-gatherer societies is that the actual labour required to provide enough food for the group often took only 3 to 5 hours a day. The rest of the time was theirs. The archaeological record suggests that the work of the Paleolithic was not a burden, but a part of a larger social fabric. There was no distinction between a time for labour and a time for life. The two are woven together. As the sun rises higher and the mist begins to lift from the river, the group remains at ease. There is a profound lack of hurry. This is the paradigm shift we're observing, the realization that for most of our history, the human day was not a race against time, but a slow, deliberate passage through it. As we watch them, a small detail stands out. On a ledge near the back of the shelter, there is a collection of brightly coloured seashells. They are from the coast, which is hundreds of miles away. They have been bored through with tiny, precise holes so they can be strung together. They sit there, discarded for the moment, but kept safe. They represent a connection to a place far beyond this valley, and a journey that was likely taken not out of necessity, but out of curiosity or trade. It is a small gone, a slight ripple in our understanding of what a survivalist life should look like. Why carry something so heavy and useless across such a vast distance if every calorie spent was a risk of death? The sun has moved further across the sky, and the light now illuminates a patch of the shelter floor that was previously in shadow. The air inside the limestone overhang is cool, but near the central hearth, the warmth is steady. The smell of wood smoke has settled into the smell of the place itself, mixing with the slightly sweet, musky scent of animal hides being cured and the sharp, metallic tang of flint being worked. This is the moment the timeline narrows, allowing us to see the granular details of a life that did not measure success by the amount of labour performed. A woman sits on a flat stone near the entrance, where the light is strongest. In her lap is a piece of thick reindeer leather. She is using a stone scraper, a tool shaped like a teardrop, with a finely napped edge to remove the last remnants of fat from the underside of the skin. The sound is a repetitive, rhythmic hiss-scrape, hiss-scrape. She does not work with the frantic energy of someone trying to meet a quota. Every few minutes she stops, looks out over the valley and speaks to a man sitting a few feet away. There is no hurry in her hands. The task will be finished when it is finished, and for now, the process is as much about the social connection as it is about the garment. Near the back of the shelter, an older man is sitting by himself. He's holding a small bone needle and a piece of abrasive sandstone. He's grinding the needle against the stone, a motion he's been performing since the group first woke up. The needle is already exceptionally thin, its point sharp enough to pierce the finest hide without tearing it. Yet, he continues the motion. He draws the bone across the sandstone over and over, his movements perfectly synchronized with the breathing of the person sleeping nearby. He does not stop when the needle reaches its optimal sharpness. He continues to grind the bone, the white dust falling in a tiny, constant stream onto his knees, long after the tool has ceased to change in shape or function. What we know from the skeletal remains of this era is that these individuals were remarkably healthy. The bones show that Paleolithic humans often grew to heights similar to those of modern Europeans and had strong, well-mineralized skeletons. They did not show the signs of chronic malnutrition or the repetitive stress injuries that would later plague the first farmers. From this evidence, we can infer that their diet was not only sufficient but remarkably diverse, consisting of hundreds of different species of plants, nuts, and animals. They were generalists in a world of abundance rather than specialists in a world of scarcity. In the middle of the shelter, several stone tools are laid out on a clean piece of hide. There are berrins for engraving, scrapers for hides, and delicate blades for cutting meat. Some are held together with a dark, amber-coloured resin made from birch bark. This is the kind of trace history leaves behind, a physical record of high-level engineering and material science. These tools were not primitive in the sense of being crude. They were the result of a lineage of knowledge that was already hundreds of thousands of years old. This suggests that the mastery of these materials was not a frantic necessity for survival, but a craft that was refined through generations of quiet observation and experimentation. Most researchers now agree that the image of the starving caveman was largely a creation of the 19th century, influenced by the harsh conditions of the Industrial Revolution. When early anthropologists looked at the past, they projected their own fears of poverty and hunger onto our ancestors. They assumed that because these people lacked technology, they must have lacked comfort. However, a more recent perspective, often referred to as the original affluent society hypothesis, suggests that hunter-gatherers were actually the most leisure-rich people in history. This theory, first popularized in the 1960s, argues that by keeping their material desires low and their knowledge of the environment high, our ancestors were able to satisfy all their needs with very little effort. In this view, they didn't work more than a few hours a day because they simply didn't see the point in producing more than they could consume. They lived in a state of Zen affluence, where they had everything they wanted because they wanted very little. Some scholars go even further, suggesting that the very concept of work as something separate from life did not exist until the invention of agriculture. They propose that activities like hunting, tool-making and gathering were experienced as play, social bonding, or spiritual practice. In this model, the Paleolithic day was not divided into hours of labour and hours of rest, but was a continuous flow of meaningful activity. There was no weekend because there was no work week. Near the woman scraping the hide, a small pile of flint flakes has accumulated on the ground. Each flake is a sharp, translucent sliver of stone, discarded during the tool-making process. They catch the light like shards of glass. These flakes are among the most common artifacts found in the archaeological record, yet they represent a massive gap in our understanding. We can count the flakes, we can measure their angles, and we can even replicate the strikes that made them. But we cannot hear the stories that were told while they were being knapped. We cannot know the jokes that were shared, or the songs that were hummed. The vast majority of the Paleolithic experience, the sounds, the emotions, the shared inner world, has left no physical trace. The sun continues its slow arc across the sky. The woman stops her scraping and sets the hide aside. She moves to the fire to help prepare a communal meal. The rhythm of the shelter remains steady, undisturbed by the passage of the hours. The light in the valley has turned to a deep amber as the sun begins to dip below the limestone ridge. The long shadows of the pine trees stretch across the river, and the air grows noticeably colder. roughly 25,000 years after the first groups established themselves in this region. The shelter remains a place of steady activity. This is where the long-term continuity of the past reveals its subtle variations. Looking closely at the floor of the rock shelter, we can observe signs of change that are so slow they would have been invisible to the people living through them. In the deep layers of the central hearth, the charcoal reveals a shift in the environment. For thousands of years, the group burned heavy oak and birch. But in the more recent layers, there is a higher frequency of pine and smaller shrubs. What we know from the sediment is that the climate was cooling very slightly over several centuries. The evidence suggests that the landscape was changing around them, yet the rhythm of their daily lives, the scraping of hides, the sharing of food, the hours of rest, persisted almost entirely unchanged. There is a subtle sign of something else too. Near the edge of the living space, where the stone floor meets the natural wall, there are several large flint cores that have been left behind. They are good stone capable of producing many more blades, yet they have been tucked into a crevice and forgotten. They sit under a thin layer of dust. In previous generations, such valuable material was rarely left unattended. It is a sign of something stopping, a small break in the pattern of meticulous resource management, though we cannot say why or what it truly meant for the people of that time. As the evening settles, the group moves closer to the fire. This is the moment when the physical record of history begins to fail us. What we see in the archaeological record are the stone tools, the bone needles, and the ivory carvings. But these represent only a tiny fraction of the world our ancestors inhabited. We find the stone scrapers, but we cannot see the wooden handles they were once fitted into, or the complex cordage made from plant fibres that bound them together. We know from the remains that they were expert processors of leather, but the actual clothing, the tailored parkas, the soft boots, the decorated pouches, has vanished, decayed by the dampness of the earth thousands of years ago. This is the absence within the historical record. Most of the Paleolithic was made of soft things, wood, skin, fur and grass. It was a world of woven baskets and carved wooden bowls that left no trace in the acidic soil. We are looking at a skeleton of a culture, stripped of its skin and its colour. What we can only imagine is the sensory richness of this life, the texture of a finely woven grass mat, the warmth of a rabbit fur blanket, and the complex scents of herbal medicines being prepared in a wooden vessel. Scholars recognise that lithic bias, the tendency to define prehistoric cultures primarily by their stone tools, has likely distorted our understanding of these societies. If we only see the stone, we see a hard world. If we could see the wood and the fibre, we would see a world of softness and intricate craft. Some researchers suggest that the primary occupation of the Paleolithic human was not hunting or gathering, but the maintenance of an elaborate oral and musical culture. They propose that for every hour spent tracking an animal, 10 hours were spent in the complex work of memory, learning the names of every plant, the histories of every lineage, and the songs that kept the group together. In this view, the work of our ancestors was entirely internal and social, leaving behind nothing for the archaeologist but a sense of profound loss. The fire in the hearth is now the only source of light. The valley outside is dark, the river a silver thread under the rising moon. The people in the shelter are settling down for the night, their breathing slowing in unison. The ivory bird sits on its ledge, catching a final flicker of the flames. The day has passed without a struggle, ending exactly as it began, in a state of unmeasured existence. There is no conclusion to be drawn from this single day, 30,000 years ago. There is only the observation of its passage. 40,000 years ago, the limestone cliffs of what is now northern Spain stood as silent sentinels over a landscape of winding rivers and deep, wooded valleys. The morning air here is sharp, carrying the scent of frost-covered ferns and the cold, metallic mist rising from the water below. Inside a broad, south-facing rock shelter carved into the side of a cliff, the light is still a pale, watery blue. This is a reconstruction of a typical morning in the deep past, where the rising sun did not signal the beginning of a workday. As the first hints of dawn touch the edge of the overhang, the life inside the shelter does not begin with a sudden burst of energy. Instead, it unfolds with the slow, heavy rhythm of a tide. The group, perhaps 30 people in total, is spread across the back of the cave, where the stone floor is covered in thick layers of dried seagrass and the warm, heavy furs of bison and deer. There is no single moment when everyone wakes up. In this era, sleep was likely not the solid 8-hour block we know today. What we know from the study of traditional societies and the biological rhythms of our species is that Paleolithic sleep was polyphasic, a series of deep rests broken by periods of wakefulness throughout the night. The charcoal remains in the central hearth tell us that the fire was never allowed to die out. Someone was always awake to tend it. In the dim light, an older woman, her hair streaked with grey, leans forward to place a few dry branches into the embers. She's been awake for an hour, sitting in the warmth, watching the shadows dance on the ceiling. She's not working in the modern sense. She is simply present, a guardian of the group's light and heat. This is the kind of trace history leaves behind, the scorched earth of a hearth that stayed warm for centuries. Near the centre of the sleeping area, a young man stirs. He pushes aside a heavy hide and sits up slowly, stretching his arms toward the stone roof. He does not check a clock or look for a schedule. He waits. He watches the light move across the cave floor, measuring the day not by minutes but by the slow arrival of warmth. Before he stands, he reaches out and touches a specific, unremarkable patch of the limestone wall. There are no paintings there, no carvings, just the cold, rough surface of the stone. He presses his palm against it for several seconds every morning before he finally rises to join the others. We have no explanation for this gesture, and the archaeological record offers no clues as to why this specific spot was touched so consistently. Researchers often point to the grandmother hypothesis to explain the social structure of these early mornings. The presence of older postmenopausal women provided a stabilizing force for the group. By tending the fire and caring for children during the early hours, they allowed the younger adults to rest longer, ensuring the overall health and survival of the tribe. This suggests a division of presence rather than a division of labour. Some anthropologists argue that the Paleolithic morning was the most important social hour of the day. They suggest that the time spent sitting around the first fire was when the group's collective identity was reinforced. Before any hunting or gathering took place, there was a period of doing nothing together, a slow communal waking that allowed for the sharing of dreams, the settling of small disputes, and the simple reaffirmation of belonging. This suggests that the physical layout of the cave was designed for this slow transition. We see the hearths placed centrally, not just for heat, but as focal points for this early morning gathering. What we can only imagine is the hush that filled the cave during these hours, the absence of mechanical noise, the steady crackle of the fire, and the low, murmuring voices of people who were in no rush to be anywhere else. As the sun climbs higher, more members of the group begin to move. A mother adjusts the wrap around her infant, her movements fluid and unhurried. Two children sit near the edge of the shelter, digging their toes into the soft, ash-strewn earth. They are not being prepared for school or chores, they are simply existing in the space. The bones show that Paleolithic children had a long period of development, a luxury of time that allowed them to learn the complexities of their environment through play and observation rather than formal instruction. The day is beginning, but it carries no weight of expectation. The group will eventually eat, and some will eventually leave the shelter to look for food or stones, but that moment is still far off. For now, there is only the morning, the fire, and the steady communal presence of the group. The sun has climbed higher above the wooded ridges, and the watery blue light of dawn has transformed into a sharp, clear gold. A long rectangular beam of sunlight now cuts deep into the shelter, illuminating the floor where the dust motes dance in slow, chaotic swirls. Roughly 40,000 years ago, this specific patch of northern Spain was a landscape of dense forests and cold, rushing rivers. But inside the limestone overhang, the world felt contained and steady. This is the moment the evidence becomes visible, the physical reality of a life that was deeply integrated with the materials of the land. In the centre of the living area, the hearth is surrounded by a ring of blackened river stones. These are not just any stones. They have been chosen for their ability to withstand the heat without cracking. Near the edge of the ash, several wooden sticks are propped up. These sticks were likely used to roast meat or tubers, but they also served as tools for moving the embers. We know from the microscopic analysis of similar sites that the wood was often treated with animal fat to make it burn longer and steadier. The remains of the fire show that these hearths were cleaned and rebuilt with meticulous care over hundreds of years. The organisation of the space suggests a high degree of domestic stability, a sense of home that was as much about the arrangement of stones as it was about the people within them. The bedding, spread thick across the back of the cave, is made of layers of dried moss, fragrant ferns, and soft seagrass brought up from the coast. Over the top are the heavy, warm hides of bison and wild horses. These beds were not just places to sleep. They were the central furniture of prehistoric life. People sat on them to work, to eat, and to talk. A young woman, who's been quietly sorting through a basket of dried berries near the entrance, suddenly stops. This is the hour when she usually moves toward the river to fetch water, a task she has performed every morning since the group arrived at the shelter. Instead, she stands up and walks toward the very back of the cave, where the light does not reach. She begins to rearrange a small, forgotten pile of limestone rubble that has sat undisturbed in the shadows for many moons. She moves the stones one by one, placing them in a new, silent order, before returning to her basket as if nothing had changed. We have no explanation for this gesture, yet it happened in the quiet gaps of the morning, part of a rhythm that didn't need to justify itself. Archaeologists have found that the living spaces of the late Paleolithic were highly structured. There were specific zones for tool-making, for hide processing, and for sleeping. This suggests that even without a clock, their lives were governed by a powerful internal order. They knew exactly where everything belonged, and this spatial familiarity contributed to the lack of stress in their daily movements. Some researchers suggest that the work of gathering food was so efficient that it left nearly 10 hours of every day completely empty. In this view, the activity we see, the sorting of berries, the sharpening of a flint blade, was not a frantic necessity. It was a form of slow labour, performed in the company of others. If you only need to find a few thousand calories to survive, and the landscape is full of game and plants, why would you hurry? This suggests that the default state of the human species was not struggle but leisure. What we know from the chemical signatures in the soil is that these areas were kept remarkably clean. The bones show that these people were not living in squalor. They were robust, well-fed, and tall. The remains of their meals, the bones of red deer and the shells of hazelnuts, are often found in secondary pits away from the main sleeping area. This is the kind of trace history leaves behind, a record of a group of people who had the time to care about the aesthetics and the hygiene of their environment. Near the fire, an older man is working on a piece of flint. He is not making a spearhead for a hunt today. He is carefully removing tiny translucent flakes from the edge of a scraper, a process called retouching. The sound is a steady, rhythmic tink, tink, tink. He pauses frequently to hold the tool up to the light, checking its symmetry. He has been doing this for an hour and the tool was already functional when he started. This is to suggest that the mastery of these materials was a source of personal pride and social identity. The act of making was as important as the object itself. As the morning moves toward noon, the group remains in this state of relaxed activity. The children are still digging in the ash, their laughter a soft, distant sound against the backdrop of the wind in the trees. The world outside is vast and full of predators, but here, under the shelter of the stone, the pace of life is dictated only by the slow movement of the golden light across the floor. The sun is now directly overhead, and the deep golden light of the morning has been replaced by a bright, flat clarity. The heat of the day has finally penetrated the outer edges of the rock shelter, warming the limestone floor and drying the damp earth near the entrance. Roughly 40,000 years ago, this was the point in the day when the communal rhythm of the morning reached a quiet plateau. Long before the first permanent houses or the concept of a midday break, the people of the northern Spanish valleys were already living in a state of balance with the passage of the hours. This is the kind of trace history leaves behind, the subtle shifting of activities as the light moves, recorded in the spatial distribution of the objects they left behind. Near the central hearth, the fire has been reduced to a bed of glowing white and red embers. The older woman who tended the flames earlier has moved to a cooler spot near the cave wall, where she is now resting her head against a folded deer hide. She is not sleeping, but she is also not engaged in any visible task. She is simply observing the valley below, her eyes tracing the path of the river as it winds through the trees. What we know from the sediment layers is that these hearths were often allowed to burn low during the middle of the day. The archaeology shows that there was no frantic need to keep the fire roaring at all times. Instead, it was kept in a state of quiet readiness, a potential energy that could be revived whenever it was needed. On a small ledge near the centre of the shelter, the bone needle that the man was grinding earlier has been left behind. It sits next to the piece of abrasive sandstone, a tiny, sharp sliver of white against the grey stone. Next to it is a small pile of discarded hazelnut shells, their brown surfaces cracked and empty. These objects are the silent witnesses to a morning spent in unhurried labour. The shells were not cleared away immediately. They were allowed to sit there, a minor detail in a living space that prioritized presence over tidiness. What we can only imagine is the auditory world that accompanied these objects. We see the shells and the needle, but we cannot hear the low-frequency humming that likely filled the cave, or the specific dialect of the language that was used to tell a joke about a missed elk. We have the physical remains, the hard things like bone and stone, but the soft world of sound and speech has been completely erased. This is the gap in our understanding. We can see what they did, but we cannot hear who they were. Scholars note that the efficiency of Paleolithic life was its most defining characteristic. Because these groups understood their environment so intimately, they did not need to spend the whole day working. The bones show that their calorie intake was high, and their energy expenditure was relatively low compared to modern humans. This allowed for long stretches of what we would call downtime, which was actually the primary time for cultural development. Some theorists suggest that this downtime was the birth of human imagination. They propose that sitting by a low fire in the middle of a warm day, with no immediate tasks to perform, was when the human mind first began to wander into the realm of the abstract. Without the pressure of a ticking clock, they were free to invent stories, to visualize future hunts, or to simply contemplate the shape of the limestone roof above them. In this view, the idleness of our ancestors was the most productive force in human history. Inside this specific rock shelter in the Cantabrian Mountains, the silence is not empty. It is a thick, textured presence, filled with the smell of dry moss and the distant rhythmic sound of a woodpecker in the forest below. The woman who was rearranging the stones in the shadows earlier has now returned to her basket of berries, but her movements have slowed even further. She picks up a single berry, looks at it for a long time, and then places it back in the basket. The task has ceased to be about completion. It has become a way to inhabit the moment. This is where the morning ends, not with a bell or a change of shift, but with a gradual slowing of the world. The golden light has begun its slow retreat toward the cave entrance. The group remains together, a collection of individuals who have satisfied their basic needs and now have nothing but time. What happens to a mind when it is given 10 hours of freedom every single day? And where did that freedom go? The valley remains still. The fire glows. The river continues its long, unhurried journey toward the sea. Imagine standing at the edge of a vast golden savanna where the grasslands meet the jagged, salt-sprayed cliffs of the South African coast. Roughly 70,000 years ago, the air here was thick with the scent of blooming wild sage and the sharp, briny tang of the Indian Ocean. The sun is a warm, steady presence overhead, casting long shadows across the red earth and the white sand of the beaches. Tens of thousands of years before the first fence was built or the first seed was planted, the landscape was a mosaic of abundance, and the people who lived here moved through it with a slow, practiced ease. This is a record of human nutrition in a world without farms, where survival was built on a deep, rhythmic understanding of the land. As the morning mist lifts from the coastal scrub, a small group of people, mostly women and older children, begins to move away from the shelter of a large sandstone cave. They are not rushing. There is no sense of urgency to find the day's calories before they run out of time. Instead, the walk itself is the primary activity. They move through the dunes and into the edge of the forest, their feet familiar with every dip in the terrain and every hidden patch of moisture in the soil. This is the moment the evidence becomes visible, the physical reality of a diet that was gathered, not produced. a woman stops near a patch of low-growing shrubs with thick, succulent leaves. She reaches down and begins to dig into the soft sand at the base of the plant, using a simple, fire-hardened wooden stick. The sound is a repetitive, rhythmic thud-scrape, thud-scrape. She's looking for tubers, energy-rich roots that have spent months storing the sun's power beneath the earth. She works slowly, pausing often to speak to the child beside her or to watch a pair of sea eagles circling in the blue sky above. As she digs, a man from the group walks along the high tide line of the beach nearby. He passes a large silver-scaled fish that has been washed up by the morning waves. It is fresh, the eyes still clear and the flesh firm. It would be an easy, high-protein meal for the group. Yet he does not stop. He does not even look at the fish. He continues his walk, his eyes focused on the rocky tide pools further down the coast, leaving the easy meal behind on the sand without a second thought. There is no explanation for why he ignores such a clear resource, and the archaeological record offers no reason for this selective behaviour. What we know from the analysis of dental calculus, the mineralised plaque on ancient teeth, is that these people possessed an extraordinary breadth of botanical knowledge. Their teeth show microscopic traces of hundreds of different plant species, ranging from starchy roots and wild grains to fibrous stalks and oily seeds. They were not merely surviving on whatever they could find. They were selecting a complex, balanced diet from a library of natural resources that they understood perfectly. We can also see this in coprolites, fossilized human waste, which reveal a high intake of fiber, minerals, and various micronutrients that are often lacking in modern, grain-heavy diets. This is the kind of trace history leaves behind. A chemical record of a species that was remarkably healthy because it was deeply connected to the diversity of its environment. The gathering continues for several hours, but it rarely feels like labour. The group moves from one resource to another as if they are following a map engraved in their collective memory. They know when the wild figs will be at their sweetest, and which patches of the forest will hold the most nutrient-dense mushrooms after a rain. Because they do not need to stay in one place to guard a crop, they are free to follow the seasonal rhythms of the land. This suggests that the abundance of the prehistoric world was not a matter of luck, but a result of this extreme ecological flexibility. As the sun reaches its peak, the group gathers under the shade of a large milkwood tree. They have several woven grass bags filled with roots, a handful of ostrich eggshells filled with water, and a collection of small, protein-rich shellfish gathered from the rocks. They sit together in the cool shadows, the only sound being the distant roar of the surf and the rustle of the wind in the leaves. They have already secured enough food for the next 2 days, and the sun is only halfway through its arc. The afternoon is theirs. There are no fields to weed, no livestock to tend, and no stores to manage. They inhabit a world where food is not something to be hoarded, but something that is always present, waiting to be gathered in the slow, rhythmic passage of the hours. The afternoon sun hangs heavy and gold over the southern cape, casting the long, flickering shadows of the milkwood trees across the red earth. On these windswept dunes, roughly 70,000 years ago, the heat is not a burden, but a steady weight that seems to slow the very air. The small group remains in the shade, the rhythm of their presence blending with the constant distant roar of the Indian Ocean and the dry rustle of the coastal scrub. This is where the story of human sustenance moves from the act of finding to the act of preparing. a process that was as much about social connection as it was about nourishment. The woman who was digging earlier now sits with her legs stretched out on the cool sand. In front of her is a flat, sun-warmed stone. She reaches into her woven grass bag and pulls out one of the large, starchy tubers. Using a small flint flake, a sharp, translucent sliver of stone no larger than a fingernail, she begins to peel the outer skin of the root. The sound is a soft, rhythmic snip slide, snip slide. She is meticulous, removing only the thinnest layer of the bitter exterior. There is no clock to race against, no deadline for the meal to be served. The task occupies her hands, leaving her mind free to wander or her voice free to join the low, murmuring conversation of the others. Beside her, a young girl is engaged in a task that has no clear survival value. She has gathered a small pile of empty, iridescent seashells from the morning's gathering. One by one, she places them in a perfect circle on a flat patch of sand. When the circle is complete, she looks at it for several seconds, then brushes the shells away and begins to arrange them again, this time in a straight line, perfectly spaced. She's been doing this for nearly an hour, her movements slow and deliberate, while the adults around her rest. No one tells her to stop. No one suggests she do something more productive. The act of arranging the shells is simply allowed to exist, a quiet ripple in the afternoon's rhythm that serves no purpose other than its own performance. This is the moment the evidence becomes visible, the physical traces of a life that did not distinguish between work and living. What we know from the analysis of dental calculus found on ancient remains is that these people consumed a staggering variety of cooked starches. The microscopic starch granules trapped in the mineralized plaque show signs of having been heated, likely roasted in the embers of a fire. This is a critical observation because cooking transformed the tough, fibrous roots of the savanna into soft, easily digestible energy. What we can only imagine is the scent of these roasting tubers, a sweet, earthy aroma that would have filled the air around the milkwood tree, a scent that meant security and comfort tens of thousands of years before the first loaf of bread was ever baked. Scholars now recognize that gathering was the true economic foundation of prehistoric life. For decades, the popular image of our ancestors focused on man the hunter, suggesting that big game hunting provided the majority of calories. However, modern anthropological studies of hunter-gatherer groups, combined with the chemical analysis of ancient bone collagen, have corrected this view. We now understand that gathering, primarily performed by women, children, and the elderly, consistently provided 70 to 80% of the group's total nutrition. The hunt was a high-risk, high-reward supplement, but it was the steady, rhythmic collection of plants and shellfish that kept the species alive. Some researchers propose that prehistoric humans were not just finding food, but actively managing the landscape in a form of proto-agriculture. This theory suggests that our ancestors used controlled fire to clear dead brush, encouraging the growth of the specific tubers and berry bushes they preferred. In this view, the wilderness was actually a carefully tended garden, managed with such a light touch that it left almost no archaeological trace. They didn't need to till the soil or plant seeds because they had learned how to dance with the natural cycles of the land, ensuring abundance through observation rather than domination. This suggests that the high level of health seen in these populations was a direct result of this diverse, non-intensive diet. The bones show almost no evidence of the vitamin deficiencies or stunted growth that would later become common in the first farming villages, where people relied on a single crop like wheat or rice. Long before agriculture reshaped the land, the human body was already optimized for this slow, varied intake of the Earth's natural offerings. The man who'd ignored the fish on the beach earlier is now sitting near the edge of the group. He's holding a piece of dried kelp, tearing off small strips and chewing them slowly. He is not hungry. He is simply tasting the salt and the sea. This is the kind of trace history leaves behind. The record of a species that had reached a point of ecological mastery so complete that they could afford to be selective, to be slow, and to spend their afternoons in the quiet company of the trees. The light is beginning to shift again, the gold turning toward a deeper orange as the sun moves toward the horizon. The heat remains, but the air is starting to carry the first cool breath of the evening sea breeze. The group is still at ease, their bags half full, their needs satisfied, inhabiting a world where the concept of a living was never something that had to be earned. The orange glow of the sun has begun to fade into a bruised purple over the southern cape, and the long rhythmic roar of the Indian Ocean grows louder as the tide begins to turn. Roughly 70,000 years ago, this specific stretch of the South African coast was not a wilderness to be conquered, but a deeply familiar home that provided everything needed for a life of leisure. Long before the first grain was ever harvested or the first animal was ever penned, the transition from the day's activities to the evening's rest was marked by a steady, unhurried ease. This is the kind of trace history leaves behind, the record of a species that had mastered the art of living with enough. Looking at the layers of shells and bone in the ancient coastal caves, we can observe signs of change that are almost imperceptible. In the higher levels of the middens, the ancient refuse heaps, the size of certain limpet shells begins to decrease slightly over several centuries. The shells show that the group was perhaps visiting this specific cove more frequently, or that the climate was shifting the local water temperatures. There is no evidence of a crisis or a shortage. This suggests that the group simply adjusted their gathering patterns, moving a few miles up the coast to another pool where the shellfish remained large and abundant. It is a sign of a system that was flexible enough to absorb change without requiring a total transformation of the way of life. The group under the milkwood tree begins to stir as the first stars appear in the deepening blue of the sky. They gather their bags of tubers and their ostrich eggshells, which are now cool to the touch. The walk back to the sandstone cave is slow. A man stops to pick up a small weathered piece of red ochre from the ground. He rubs it between his thumb and forefinger, leaving a faint rust-coloured stain on his skin. He does not use it to mark a map or record a tally. He simply carries it back to the cave, a small fragment of the earth kept for a reason we cannot name. This is the moment where the permanence of the landscape meets the fragility of human memory. What we know from the archaeological record is that these people lived in a world of incredible botanical density. Their knowledge was not limited to a few staple crops, like wheat or corn, but extended to hundreds, perhaps thousands, of different species of plants, fungi, and seaweeds. What we can only imagine is the vast encyclopedia of oral knowledge that accompanied this diet. The names of every root, the songs used to remember which berries ripen in which moon, and the complex stories that explained the relationship between the people and the forest. This is the great silence of history. The archaeological record is a hard record, made of stone, bone, and shell. But the majority of the human experience in this era was made of soft things. We find the stone scrapers, but the woven grass bags have long since decayed. We find the scorched hearths, but the thousands of words spoken around them have vanished into the salt air. This suggests that when we transitioned to agriculture thousands of years later, we did not just change how we ate. We narrowed our world. We traded a library of thousands of plants for a handful of grains, and we traded a life of varied, unhurried movement for a life of static, repetitive labour. Anthropologists agree that the diet of prehistoric hunter-gatherers was significantly more diverse than almost any diet in the modern world. By relying on a vast range of wild resources, they were naturally protected against the failure of any single species. If the tubers were scarce, the shellfish were plentiful. If the berries failed, the nuts remained. This redundancy in their food system was the secret to their long-term stability and their extraordinary amount of free time. Some researchers suggest that the work of gathering was actually a form of environmental education that never ended. They propose that every gathering trip was a way to monitor the health of the land, a slow, sensory check-in with the world that provided them with everything. In this view, the idleness we observe in the afternoons was not a lack of activity, but a state of deep observation, a way of staying in sync with a world that was never seen as something separate from themselves. The group reaches the sandstone cave just as the last light disappears from the horizon. The central fire is revived, the small flames casting a warm, flickering light against the red stone walls. The smell of the roasting tubers begins to rise again, mixing with the scent of the sea spray and the dry grass. The bags are set down, the water is shared, and the group settles into the familiar geometry of the evening circle. The day has passed as tens of thousands of other days had passed before it. There was no struggle for existence, only a slow, deliberate participation in the abundance of the coast. The circle of seashells on the sand has been washed away by the tide, leaving no trace behind. The fire continues to burn low. The ocean continues its rhythmic pulse against the cliffs. You do not need to memorize the layout of these ancient camps or the specific hours they kept. Let your shoulders drop and find a more comfortable position. The narrative will continue to move forward, even if you choose to let the specific details fade. We are exploring a rhythm of life that did not rely on being busy. Roughly 25,000 years ago, the afternoon sun in the Weser Valley of what is now France hung low and heavy in the sky, casting a long slanted glow into the deep recesses of a limestone rock shelter. The air here is still, carrying the faint earthy scent of damp stone, the musk of cured reindeer hides, and the sharp, sticky aroma of pine resin being heated over a small fire. This is the moment where we observe the intersection of necessity and art, a time of day when the primary tasks of the morning have ended, and the slow, deliberate work of the hands begins. Inside the shelter, the rhythm of life is steady and unhurried. The sound of the river below is a constant low-frequency hum, a background noise that anchors the silence of the cave. Near the entrance, where the light is strongest, a man sits on a flat, sun-warmed stone. In his right hand he holds a heavy weathered section of reindeer antler. In his left a large core of dark, translucent flint. He strikes the edge of the stone with the antler mallet, a precise, practiced blow. Tink! A thin, razor-sharp flake of flint falls onto the leather apron spread across his knees. He pauses, looking at the stone in the golden light, before striking again. Tink! This is the story of the quiet labour that shaped the majority of the human experience, a form of work that was never separated from the rhythm of the day, but was instead a slow, social craft that occupied the quietest hours of prehistoric life. Archaeological findings from this era show that the production of tools was not a frantic industrial process. Instead, it was a highly skilled, almost meditative activity. We can see this in the debitage, the thousands of tiny stone flakes found around ancient hearths. The flakes show that the napper was not just trying to make a sharp edge as quickly as possible. They were following a complex mental map of the stone, anticipating its fractures and working with its natural geometry. As the man continues his work, a woman sits nearby, leaning against the cool white limestone of the cave wall. She's working with a series of tiny hollow bird bones that have been cut into uniform lengths. Using a piece of fine, twisted plant fibre, she's threading the bones together to create a decorative fringe for a leather garment. Her movements are repetitive and fluid. She slides a bone onto the cord, ties a small, tight knot, and then repeats the process. Slide, knot, slide, knot. While she works, she occasionally stops to look at a small, smooth river pebble she has placed on a ledge just above her head. The pebble has no markings, no carvings, and no apparent use. Every few minutes she reaches up, turns the pebble exactly 90 degrees to the right, and then returns to her bone threading. There is no explanation for this behaviour, and it does not seem to serve any functional or ritual purpose we can identify. It is a slight gawn, a ripple in the expected rhythm of her labour, that suggests the inner life of these people contained habits and personal patterns that the archaeological record can never fully explain. What we know from the analysis of Paleolithic living sites is that these shelters were organised for long-term comfort. The floor near the fire is packed hard from the pressure of many feet, but the areas where people sat to work are often covered in soft, dry grass or thick piles of discarded wood shavings. The physical traces suggest that work was not a separate part of life to be endured, but a communal experience. People sat together, their hands busy with stone and bone, while their voices shared the news of the valley or the memories of previous seasons. What we can only imagine is the tactile richness of this environment. The cool, smooth feel of a finished ivory needle, the grainy texture of the sandstone used to sharpen a blade, the weight of a heavy fur cloak draped over the shoulders. These people lived in a world of physical immediacy, where every object they used was something they had seen, touched, and shaped with their own hands. The man with the flint core finally stops. He has produced a series of perfect, identical blades, each one capable of cutting through leather like a modern steel knife. He does not pack them away or prepare them for a hunt. Instead, he lays them out in a row on the stone beside him, watching as the retreating sunlight catches the sharp, glassy edges. He picks up his antler mallet and carefully places it in a pile of cold ash near the edge of the hearth, where the fine grey dust immediately clings to its polished surface. He leaves it there, half buried and unprotected, and sits back to watch the river. This is the kind of trace history leaves behind, the record of a life where the tools of survival were also the instruments of a deep, unmeasured leisure. The orange light of the late afternoon has crept further into the rock shelter, reaching the piles of discarded flint and the soft, ash-covered earth near the sleeping area. Roughly 25,000 years ago, the limestone walls of the Weser Valley served as a permanent canvas for the daily habits of a people who lived without the pressure of a ticking clock. The air is slightly heavier now, filled with the sharp smell of scraped leather and the earthy, bitter scent of birch tar being heated to bind stone to wood. This is where the evidence becomes visible, not in the grand monuments of later civilizations, but in the tiny, repetitive actions that filled the unhurried hours of the day. Near the central hearth, an older woman is working on a set of bone needles. She has a section of a horse's leg bone, which had been split lengthwise. She holds a small, sharp flint blade in her right hand and carefully carves a groove down the centre of the bone. The sound is a low, rhythmic scritch, scritch, scritch. She's not hurrying to finish. She pauses to adjust her posture, leaning her back against a smooth section of the cave wall, and watches a hawk glide over the river for several minutes before returning to her task. What we know from the microscopic analysis of these bone needles is that they were polished to an extraordinary degree. After carving the shape, the craftsperson would spend hours rubbing the bone against a block of fine-grained sandstone, using water as a lubricant. The white dust from the bone collects in the creases of her palms and on the dark fur of her wrap. This is the kind of trace history leaves behind, a physical record of labour that was as much about the sensory experience of the material as it was about the final product. As she works, a man sitting a few feet away is preparing a hunting spear. He has already finished the flint point. It is a long, elegant leaf shape with razor-sharp edges. He takes a piece of rough granite and begins to rub the edge of the finished flint point, systematically dulling the sharpness until the edge is rounded and blunt. Once it is blunted, he picks up his antler-flaking tool and begins to nap the edge back to a sharp point. He repeats this exact process, sharpening, then deliberately dulling, then sharpening again, 4 times over the course of the next hour. He does not use the spear, and he does not look at anyone else while he does it. This is a behavioural microtension, a repetitive act that fits the physical rhythm of the afternoon, but serves no logical purpose for survival or utility. Researchers agree that the late Paleolithic marked a significant leap in human cognitive specialization. The artifacts show that not everyone was making every tool. Instead, certain individuals developed high-level skills in specific crafts, such as needle-making or flint knapping, suggesting a social structure where expertise was recognized and valued. This specialization was only possible because the group as a whole had enough free time to allow individuals to spend hundreds of hours mastering a single material. Some anthropologists argue that the beauty of prehistoric tools was a form of social currency. They suggest that an exceptionally well-made spear thrower or a finely carved bone pendant was not just a tool, but a signal of the maker's patience, skill, and abundance of time. In a society without money or property, the ability to create something beautiful was a way to earn respect and build social bonds. Work, in this sense, was a performance of one's place within the group. There is a theory that the playful nature of this craft labour was the primary driver of human innovation. Some scholars propose that because our ancestors were not constantly struggling to survive, they were free to waste materials on experiments. They might try a new way of braiding sinew, or a different angle for a stone scraper simply because they were curious. In this model, the modern technological world was born not from necessity, but from the long, calm afternoons of prehistoric boredom. This suggests that the items we find in the archaeological record are only the most durable fragments of a much larger world of craft. For every stone blade, there were likely dozens of carved wooden bowls, woven grass mats, and braided fibre cords that have long since returned to the earth. What we can only imagine is the complexity of these lost objects. The patterns dyed into the leather, the specific way a handle was carved to fit a particular hand, and the stories that were woven into the very fabric of the things they made. The woman with the bone needle finally reaches the stage of carving the eye. She uses a tiny pointed flint drill, spinning it between her palms with a slow, steady motion. Whir-click, whir-click. The hole is perfect, smaller than a grain of sand. She sets the needle down on a flat stone beside her and reaches for a piece of braided sinew thread. The day is not over, but the work is not a burden. It is a way of inhabiting the shelter, a way of marking the passage of the light, and a way of being together in the long, unmeasured hush of the valley. The golden slant of light has retreated completely from the interior of the rock shelter, leaving the limestone walls in a deep, cool shade of violet and grey. Roughly 25,000 years ago, the transition from the afternoon's craft to the evening's rest in the Weser Valley was almost imperceptible. The air is now sharp with the scent of the approaching night, a mix of cold river mist, the fading aroma of birch tar, and the dry, sweet smell of the grass bedding. This is where the story of prehistoric labour reaches its natural pause, a state of existence that prioritised the quality of the hour over the quantity of the product. As the dusk deepens, the woman who was working on the bone needles sets her sandstone grinding block aside. She picks up a handful of the white bone dust that has accumulated on her lap and lets it trickle slowly through her fingers onto the floor. It forms a tiny pale mound in the dirt. Beside her, a half-finished ivory bead lies in a shallow crevice in the stone wall. It has been shaped and smoothed, but the central hole remains undrilled. What we know from the debris in these shelters is that many objects were simply left in various stages of completion. There is no sign of a sudden interruption or a move forced by hunger. Instead, it suggests a lack of pressure. The task was simply allowed to stop when the desire to continue faded. In the deeper layers of the shelter floor, we can observe signs of change that occurred over many generations. The styles of the flint points shift slightly. The carvings on the antler batons become more geometric and less naturalistic. This suggests that even in a world of profound stability, human culture was never static. Yet, these changes happened over such immense spans of time that no single individual would have felt the world moving beneath their feet. They lived in a state of cultural equilibrium where the methods of their ancestors remained perfectly sufficient for the world they inhabited. This is the kind of trace history leaves behind, the record of a life where progress was not a goal, but an accidental byproduct of living. As the man who was working the flint stands to join the others by the fire, he leaves the row of razor-sharp blades exactly where they were laid out. They will be used later, but for now they are just stones catching the last of the ambient light. This is the moment history becomes a series of gaps. What we know from the physical remains is only the rigid framework of their world. We find the stone, the bone, and the ivory. But these people lived in a world dominated by materials that the earth has long since reclaimed. What we can only imagine is the soft history of the Weser Valley, the hundreds of hours spent weaving intricate baskets from willow shoots, the carving of wooden bowls that felt warm to the touch, and the tailoring of complex multi-layered clothing that allowed them to thrive in the subarctic cold. We see the bone needle, but we cannot see the elaborate embroidery made from dyed plant fibres that likely decorated their cloaks. We see the charred wood in the hearth, but we cannot hear the epic oral histories that were passed down through the centuries, or the specific melodies played on bone flutes that once echoed off these limestone walls. Most archaeologists acknowledge that our view of the Paleolithic is distorted by the preservation bias. Because stone is the only material that survives for tens of thousands of years, we have labelled these people Stone Age. In reality, they likely lived in a Wood Age or a Fibre Age. Their lives were not hard and grey, but were filled with the textures and colours of a vast array of organic materials that simply did not last. Some researchers propose that the primary purpose of their craft was not utility at all, but memory. They suggest that the act of carving a bone or knapping a stone was a way to ground a story into a physical object. In this view, a spear was not just a tool for hunting, but a record of a particular lineage or a specific event in the group's past. When they sat for hours in the afternoon light, they weren't just making tools, they were writing their history into the world, one flake of stone at a time. This central fire is now a steady, pulsing glow in the centre of the shelter. The group has gathered in a loose circle, their silhouettes cast large against the white stone of the roof. The sounds of the day, the tink of flint, the scritch of bone, have faded, replaced by the crackle of the wood and the low, murmuring voices of the group. The ivory bird carving remains on its ledge, a small, polished form that has survived the passage of hours and will survive the passage of millennia. The afternoon has dissolved into the night. There is no sense of exhaustion, no feeling that the day was spent. It was simply lived, a slow and deliberate passage through a world that required very little and offered everything. The river continues its steady hum in the valley below. The mist rises. The group remains in the circle of the fire. Roughly 35,000 years ago, the late afternoon sun hung suspended over a high sandstone ridge, looking down into a broad grassy basin that stretched toward the horizon. The air here is beginning to cool, carrying the scent of dry yellow stalks, cooling rock, and the faint, sweet aroma of wild-flowering shrubs. This is a record of human downtime in a world before the invention of productivity, where the most significant portion of the day was defined not by what was accomplished, but by the simple act of being present. As the shadows of the tall grass begin to lengthen and stretch across the red earth, the group, perhaps 25 individuals, is gathered on a flat natural terrace overlooking the basin. This is where the shape of time becomes empty of labour. They have returned from their morning gathering and their brief, successful hunt several hours ago. The food has been shared, the tools have been maintained, and the immediate needs of the body have been satisfied. Now, as the sky transitions from a deep blue to a bruised orange, there is nothing left to do. This is the moment the story of human leisure begins, long before the first schedule was ever scratched into a clay tablet. On the edge of the terrace, a man is sitting alone. He is leaned back against a smooth boulder, his legs crossed at the ankles. In his hands he holds a long, thin blade of dried grass. He is not weaving it, nor is he using it as a tool. For the last 45 minutes he's done nothing but rotate the grass blade between his thumb and forefinger, watching the way the light catches the tiny golden fibres. Every few minutes he stops, looks intensely at a small green lizard sunning itself on a nearby stone, and then returns to rotating the grass. He does not speak, he does not move his body, and he shows no sign of boredom or restlessness. This is an early microtension, a lingering, unexplained focus on a singular, inconsequential detail that suggests a mind completely untethered from the modern requirement to be useful. What we know from the consensus of modern hunter-gatherer studies is that for the vast majority of our history, work was a minor part of the day. Anthropologists who have lived with the few remaining traditional societies observe that providing for all the group's caloric needs rarely takes more than 4 to 6 hours of moderate effort. The remaining hours, the vast majority of the waking day, are empty. The archaeological remains in these high-ridge sites show no signs of frantic industry during these hours. There are no massive piles of unfinished tools or evidence of rushed preparations. Instead, the traces show a life of profound pause. We can see this in the physical record of the terrace floor. There are small, deliberate clusters of polished river stones tucked into the crevices of the rock, far from any hearth or tool-making area. These stones were brought up from the valley floor miles away and were likely used in games or as simple objects of tactile interest. This suggests that the prehistoric afternoon was not a vacuum of activity, but a space for play and observation. Near the centre of the terrace, 2 children are sitting in the dust. They are not being taught, nor are they performing chores. One child holds a small bone whistle, carved with 3 precise holes. He blows into it occasionally, a short, breathy note that carries on the wind. The other child is tracing circles in the soft orange dust with a stick, over and over, erasing them with her palm and starting again. The movements are slow and repetitive. This suggests that the long period of human childhood was primarily spent in this state of unhurried exploration, allowing the brain to develop in a landscape of security and freedom. What we can only imagine is the internal experience of this emptiness. We see the bone whistle and the polished stones, but we cannot feel the weight of 10 hours of daily freedom. In the modern world, we often view doing nothing as a lapse or a failure, something to be filled with entertainment or distracted by technology. But for our ancestors, this was the default state of existence. It was the background against which all of human culture, language, art, music, was eventually composed. The sun continues its slow descent, the light turning the basin below into a sea of gold and deep violet. The man on the edge of the terrace finally lets the blade of grass fall to the ground. He does not stand up. He remains exactly where he is, his eyes fixed on the horizon, watching the first star appear in the east. The rhythm of the group is steady, a collective pause that has lasted for thousands of years and will continue for thousands more. The golden light of the afternoon has softened, turning the high sandstone ridge into a landscape of deep reds and long blurred shadows. Roughly 35,000 years ago, this specific terrace served as a place of profound rest, a space where the hours were not spent producing but simply passing. This is where the internal world of our ancestors begins to emerge through the absence of labour. The air is remarkably clear, and the steady rhythmic sound of the wind through the dry grass stalks creates a backdrop for the quiet movements of the group. In the centre of the terrace, a woman is sitting with a young child resting across her lap. This is a scene of social grooming, a behaviour that has deep roots in our evolutionary history. She is using a small, polished bone sliver to clean the dirt from beneath the child's fingernails. Usually this is a quick, affectionate task, part of the daily maintenance of the body and the bond between parent and offspring. However, as the sun moves lower, the woman's focus becomes strangely fixed. She spends nearly 30 minutes on the child's thumb alone, scraping the same clean edge of the nail over and over with a steady mechanical rhythm. Even after the nail is perfectly clean and the child has drifted into a light sleep, she continues the motion, her eyes vacant, her hands moving in a frequency that seems disconnected from the physical requirements of the task. This is a behavioral microtension, a familiar rhythmic act that has lost its utilitarian context, stretching out to fill the immense, empty hours of the prehistoric afternoon. These suggest that these long periods of inactivity were not merely breaks, but were the primary environment in which human social intelligence developed. Near the child, a collection of small, perfectly spherical stones is scattered on a woven grass mat. These are not local stones. They are made of a dense, dark volcanic rock that must have been carried from a site dozens of miles away. They have no sharp edges for cutting, no weight for grinding, and no signs of being used as hammers. What we know from the presence of such objects in non-utilitarian contexts is that our ancestors spent a great deal of time and energy collecting things simply because they were pleasing to the touch or the eye. This suggests that the prehistoric mind was already engaged in a world of aesthetics and play. Anthropologists observe that in groups with low labour requirements, social touch, such as grooming or huddling, occupies up to 20% of their waking hours. This behaviour is not just about hygiene. It is a vital mechanism for reducing group tension and reinforcing the trust needed for survival. In the Paleolithic, where the group was the only safety net, these hours of doing nothing together were the glue that held human society together. Some evolutionary psychologists propose the cognitive surplus hypothesis. They argue that because the hunter-gatherer diet was so energy-dense and their labour requirements so low, the human brain was left with a massive surplus of energy every day. Without the distractions of agriculture or modern technology, this energy was channeled into internal simulation, thinking about the past, imagining the future, and creating the first complex mythologies. In this view, leisure was not a luxury. It was the biological engine that grew the human brain to its current size. There is a theory that the play seen in prehistoric children was the origin of all human engineering. By spending thousands of hours rolling stones, stacking branches, and blowing through hollow bones, children were essentially performing long-term physics experiments. This unguided, unhurried exploration allowed the species to understand the properties of the world in a way that would later make the invention of complex tools possible. We see the bone whistle, but we cannot know the centuries of meaningless play that led to its creation. What we know from the physical remains is that the health of these people remained high even during these sedentary hours. The bones do not show the signs of atrophy or metabolic disease that characterize modern sedentary life. They were strong, lean, and capable of sudden intense physical bursts, yet they spent the majority of their lives in this state of deep, unbothered calm. The sounds of the afternoon remained steady. The child on the woman's lap breathes deeply, his chest rising and falling in time with the wind. The bone sliver continues its rhythmic scrape, a tiny, repetitive sound that marks the passage of time without a clock. The hawks continue to circle high above the grassy basin, their shadows flickering briefly over the red stone of the terrace. The emptiness of the afternoon is a heavy physical presence. It is a world where the concept of wasting time is impossible, because time is seen as an infinite resource, a continuous flow that requires no management and no justification. The bruised purple of the horizon has begun to deepen into a cold, dark indigo, and the vast grassy basin below the sandstone ridge is now a sea of shifting shadows. Roughly 35,000 years ago, this was the moment when the immense, unhurried freedom of the afternoon began to dissolve into the structured proximity of the night. The air is sharp and thin, carrying the scent of dry yellow stalks, cooling rock, and the first hints of wood smoke from the valley below. This is where we observe the subtle drifting of human habit, a record of a society that lived in such perfect equilibrium with the world that change was almost entirely invisible. Looking at the physical record of this high terrace site, we can observe signs of a change that occurred over hundreds of generations. In the lower, older layers of the sediment, the clusters of polished volcanic stones are arranged with a specific geometric precision. In the more recent layers, however, these same stones are found scattered randomly across the terrace floor, as if the particular game or ritual that once governed their placement had simply faded from the group's memory. What we know from the archaeological remains is that the group continued to bring these stones up from the valley, but the way they interacted with them shifted. This is a sign of a tradition stopping, a small, silent break in the continuity of human habit that no one alive at the time would have noticed. There is another sign of change found in the tiny fragments of flint scattered near the edge of the ridge. The debitage shows that the tools made here became slightly smaller and more uniform over several centuries. This suggests that the environment was providing different resources, perhaps smaller game or different types of plants, and the group adjusted the rhythm of their craft to match. Yet, the amount of time spent in labour did not increase. The evidence suggests that even as the world around them underwent a slow, geological transformation, the human commitment to leisure remained the central pillar of their existence. As the dusk settles, the man on the edge of the ridge stands up. He leaves the polished volcanic spheres where they lay on the grass mat. He does not pack them away or take them with him. He walks toward the centre of the terrace, his feet making a soft, rhythmic crunch-slide sound against the dry red earth. He picks up the small bone whistle that the child had been playing with and holds it up to the first pale light of the stars. This is the moment history becomes a vast, silent gap. What we know from the physical traces is only the shell of this existence. We have the stones, the bone whistle, and the layers of orange dust. But these represent only the tiny, durable fragments of a life that was primarily composed of things that leave no mark. We cannot know the names they gave to the stars now appearing above the ridge. We cannot hear the specific rhythm of the songs played on that bone whistle, or the stories that were whispered to the children as they drifted to sleep on this terrace. This is the great unrecorded history of the human species. If these people spent 10 hours of every day in a state of freedom, then the vast majority of the human experience, the billions of hours of thought, conversation, and play, has been lost. We see the Stone Age as a time of primitive tools, but it was likely a thought age, a time when the primary human activity was the internal simulation of the world. We're looking at a species that was rich in time, even if they were poor in objects. This suggests that when we eventually moved into the busy, productive world of agriculture, we did not just change our economy, we lost the ability to inhabit the silence of our own minds. The terrace is now nearly dark. The red stone has lost the last of its warmth, and the long grass is a wall of blackness against the deep blue sky. The group begins to move toward the path that leads back to the valley floor, their movements slow and coordinated. There is no urgency in their departure. They have spent the day in the slow, deliberate work of doing nothing, and they carry the weight of that freedom with them as they descend. The bone whistle is placed back in a shallow crevice in the limestone wall, where it will wait for another afternoon 30,000 years in the future. The circles in the dust have been partially obscured by the evening breeze, leaving only a few faint curved lines behind. This is where the afternoon ends. There is no conclusion to be found in these empty hours, only the observation of a species that once knew how to exist without a purpose. The wind continues to move through the dry stalks. The stars continue to brighten. The ridge returns to its cold, silent state. Roughly 36,000 years ago, the limestone cliffs overlooking the Ardèche Valley in what is now southern France stood cold and sharp against a moonless night. Outside the cave mouth, the winter air is thin and biting, carrying the scent of frozen pine needles and the distant, heavy musk of a passing woolly rhino. But inside the deep, winding chambers of the limestone, the world is transformed into a space of concentrated warmth and flickering light. This is where the day's physical labour ends and the group's inner life begins. A record of how prehistoric humans used the darkness not for sleep, but for the creation of meaning. The central hearth, located several dozen meters back from the cave entrance, is a steady, pulsing heart of red and gold. The group, perhaps 30 individuals, is gathered in a loose circle, their silhouettes cast large and distorted against the uneven stone walls. This is the moment the timeline narrows, focusing on the hours that were dedicated entirely to the social and spiritual fabric of the tribe. Long before the first written word or the first structured temple, the rhythm of the evening was already a profound, repetitive ritual. Inside the circle, the movement is minimal. A woman leans back against a damp, cool section of the cave wall, her eyes half closed as she listens to the steady, rhythmic crackle of the dry oak branches in the fire. Near her a man is holding a small, hollow bone flute. He does not play a melody. Instead, every few minutes, he reaches out and taps the flute against a nearby stalactite, producing a single, clear, high-pitched note that rings through the chamber and then fades into the hiss of the flames. He does this with a mechanical regularity that has no apparent connection to any surrounding activity. This is an early microtension, a singular, repetitive sound that exists without explanation, a quiet gain in the evening stillness that suggests a private ritual or a thought process we can never fully recover. The archaeology of these deep cave sites shows that they were used as more than just shelters. The charcoal remains in hearths like those found at Chauvet. Cave indicate that fires were maintained for long periods, not just for heat or cooking, but as the primary source of illumination for the entire group's social life. What we know from the analysis of the cave floors is that these were communal spaces where the group gathered to process the events of the day and reinforce their collective identity. This suggests that the evening was the most active intellectual period of the Paleolithic human's life. Near the fire, a young man is preparing a mixture of red ochre and rendered animal fat in a small stone hollow. The scent is heavy and metallic, mixing with the smoky aroma of the wood and the sweet, fatty smell of roasting marrow bones. He works slowly, stirring the pigment with a short, stiff brush made of animal hair. His hands are stained a deep rust red, a colour that would have been a powerful visual marker of his participation in the evening's work. The physical traces, the ochre stains on the walls and the discarded stone lamps, show that this was a deliberate, unhurried process. What we can only imagine is the auditory world that filled this space. We see the stone lamps and the pigment, but we cannot hear the stories that were being woven into the air. In the modern world, we often view the night as a time to be skipped or ignored, a period of rest before the next day of production. But for our ancestors, the night was the canvas. It was the time when the boundaries between the physical world and the world of the mind became thin, and where the hours of freedom were used to build a universe of myth and memory. This suggests that the high level of social cohesion seen in these groups was a direct result of these long, firelit evenings. By sitting together in the warmth, sharing food and sound, they created a sense of belonging that was stronger than any physical threat. The bones of the individuals found in these regions show that they were part of a society that cared for the injured and the elderly, a social commitment that was likely reinforced during these hours of quiet, communal presence. As the night progresses, the fire burns lower and the shadows on the walls become longer and deeper. The group remains in the circle, their breathing slowing in unison. The man with the bone flute taps the stone one final time, the sound echoing through the darkness of the further reaches of the cave. The day is over, but the meaning created during these hours remains, a silent weight that will be carried into the dreams of the group. The valley outside remains cold and silent. The fire glows red. The circle remains unbroken. Deep within the shadowy recesses of the limestone, roughly 36,000 years ago, the golden light of the central hearth is supplemented by smaller portable flames. These are the physical tools of the prehistoric evening: sandstone lamps, small and palm-sized, filled with rendered animal fat and a wick made of twisted moss. The light they cast is orange and unstable, causing the jagged surfaces of the cave walls to appear as though they are breathing. The air here is heavy, thick with the scent of burning grease, the sharp tang of mineral pigments, and the faint dry smell of old soot. This is where the material remnants of the prehistoric mind become undeniable. Near the fire, a man is working on a specific section of the wall where the limestone is smooth and pale. He holds a piece of charred wood in his right hand, a simple stick of oak charcoal. He's not drawing an outline. He's following a shape that he seems to see already present in the stone. He uses the charcoal to define the curve of a bison's shoulder, his movements slow and deliberate. Every few minutes he pauses to smudge the black line with his thumb, creating a soft, blurred shadow that gives the animal a sense of three-dimensional weight. The sound is a constant rhythmic scrape as the charcoal meets the rock. A woman sits slightly apart from the main group near a small natural alcove in the stone. She has a shallow stone bowl containing a small amount of black manganese pigment. Every few seconds she dips her index finger into the dark, oily paste and taps it against the limestone wall in front of her. She's not creating a figure or a pattern. She's simply making a small circular mark, one after the other, in a single horizontal line. She's been doing this for over an hour. Even after the pigment in her bowl has run dry and her finger leaves no visible mark on the stone, she continues the motion. The same rhythmic tap against the cold rock, the same interval of breath, the same vacant gaze toward the shadows. This is a behavioral microtension, a familiar act of marking that has detached itself from the purpose of decoration, repeating in the quiet dark until it becomes a rhythm of the body rather than a task of the mind. What we know from the physical traces in caves like Chauvet is that these paintings were not the work of a single moment. The layers of charcoal and ochre show that animals were drawn, erased, and redrawn over thousands of years. This suggests that the act of painting was a continuous, repetitive engagement with the past, a way for the group to stay in dialogue with those who had occupied the cave centuries before them. We can see the overlapping lines of lions and rhinos, a physical record of a society that valued the continuity of its stories over the novelty of new ones. Most archaeologists now agree that these deep cave paintings were not art in the modern sense of a finished product for display. Instead, the evidence suggests that the primary importance lay in the act of creation itself. The fact that many of the most intricate drawings are located in the most difficult, cramped parts of the cave indicates that the physical experience of reaching the stone and the rhythmic application of the pigment was the central part of the ritual. Some researchers propose that these evenings were a form of proto-literacy. They argue that the painting served as a vast collective library of information. By sitting in the firelight and tracing the shapes of the animals, the group was teaching the younger members not just how to hunt, but how to understand the complex behaviours and spirits of the world around them. In this view, the idleness of the afternoon was merely the preparation for this intense period of evening education, where the tribe's collective knowledge was woven into the memory of the children. There is a theory that these cave rituals were a way of managing the psychological weight of their immense free time. By entering the deep darkness and focusing on the slow, repetitive work of painting and storytelling, the group was practicing a form of collective meditation. This helped to maintain the social harmony necessary for survival, turning the potential boredom of an unhurried life into a rich, internal universe of meaning. The physical remains of the evening are scattered across the cave floor, the broken fragments of charcoal, the spilled drops of red ochre, and the scorched sandstone of the lamps. What we can only imagine is the tactile reality of being in that circle, the cool dampness of the stone against your back, the steady warmth of the fat lamps on your skin, and the feeling of the rough limestone under your fingertips as you follow the lines drawn by someone 10 generations ago. The night continues to move outside, the stars shifting in their cold, silent arcs over the Ardèche Valley. But here, in the heart of the stone, the rhythm of the group remains steady and unmoving. The man with the charcoal continues to blur the lines of the bison. The woman continues her rhythmic tap against the alcove wall. The day's labour has been forgotten, replaced by this slow, deliberate construction of a world that exists only in the firelight. Roughly 36,000 years ago, as the night reaches its deepest point in the Ardèche Valley, the warmth of the central hearth begins to retreat. The fire has collapsed into a thick bed of grey ash, with only a few stubborn embers pulsing like tiny dying stars in the centre of the chamber. Outside the cave, the subarctic air is frozen and unmoving, but inside the limestone heart of the mountain, the group remains in a state of shared presence. This is the moment when the narrative of the night dissolves into the reality of the earth, leaving behind only the most durable fragments of the human spirit. In the deeper galleries of the cave, far beyond the reach of the main fire, we can observe signs of a change that occurred over vast stretches of time. In one specific alcove, the limestone wall is covered in the faint, peeling remnants of drawings made 500 years before the current group arrived. These older lines, figures of long-extinct bears and lions, are starting to fade, obscured by a thin, natural layer of translucent calcite. The people sitting in the cave tonight do not attempt to repair or refresh these ancient marks. Instead, they have moved their activities to a different chamber altogether. This is a sign of a tradition stopping. A small, unnoticed shift where a space that was once vital and sacred has begun to return to its original unmarked state. There is no evidence of a crisis or a rejection of the past. The group has simply allowed that specific memory to go cold, following a new rhythm in a different part of the darkness. The man who was drawing the bison earlier has stopped. He leans forward and places his small charcoal stick on a flat limestone ledge near the wall. He does not look back at the animal he has created. He does not check the symmetry of the horns or the shading of the flank. The act of bringing the shape out of the stone is finished, and the object itself is now just a collection of carbon molecules clinging to the rock. He moves back to the circle of the fire, his feet making no sound on the packed earth floor. This is where the physical object stops speaking, and the void begins. What we know from the remains of the lamps and the charcoal is the mechanical process of the evening. We can see how they prepared the pigment and where they stood to reach the ceiling, but the majority of this prehistoric night remains a vast, silent gap. This is the great unrecorded history of the human mind. What we see in the archaeological record are the hard things, the stone, the charcoal, the bone. But the human experience is made of soft things. We find the bone flute, but the specific melody it played, the sequence of notes that could make a child laugh or a hunter remember a lost companion, has vanished. We see the circle of people, but the language they spoke is a ghost. The names they had for the bison, the stars and each other have been erased by the passage of 36 millennia. Scholars recognise that we are looking at the fossilised remains of a culture that was primarily oral and performative. The paintings were not meant to be static images, but were likely props for a larger experience involving music, storytelling, and perhaps even dance. When we look at them today in the silence of a modern museum or a protected cave, we're only seeing the script of a play that has been finished for 30,000 years. Some researchers propose that the primary work of these firelit evenings was the maintenance of a complex social memory that acted as a survival manual. They suggest that the stories told around the fire were not just myths, but were encrypted data sets about the behaviour of animals, the properties of plants, and the history of the landscape. In this view, the idleness of the day was a necessary state of mental rest, allowing the brain to focus entirely on the high-fidelity transmission of this information during the night. Our ancestors were not killing time. They were building a library of the mind that required constant rhythmic repetition to survive. The fire is now a dull, dark red. The silhouettes of the group have merged into a single, low mass of shadows against the cave floor. One by one, the individuals settle into their bedding of dried grass and furs. The ivory bird carving, the bone needles, and the flint blades are all tucked away or left in the dust, their roles for the day complete. There is no sense of urgency for tomorrow, no anxiety about what was not accomplished. The night has performed its function. It has woven the individuals back into a group, and the group back into the world. There is no conclusion to be drawn from this evening in the deep past. There is only the observation of its passage and the recognition of the immense, unhurried space that once existed in every human day. The limestone remains cold. The embers fade. The breathing of the group becomes a steady, collective rhythm that carries them into the dark. As we move toward the center of this story, allow the specific tools and objects to blur into a single image. Focus instead on the shape of a life lived without pressure. A significant pattern is starting to emerge from the deep past. If we stand back from these individual rock shelters, these coastal caves, and these high sandstone ridges, we begin to see the shape of something vast. We have walked through the morning in Spain, the afternoon in France, and the evening in the Southern Cape, observing the granular details of a life that left behind only the hardest fragments of its existence. When we look at these moments collectively, we're no longer looking at isolated tribes or accidental stretches of leisure. We're looking at the default state of the human species, a state that persisted, almost entirely unchanged for 99% of our history. We have seen the signs of this persistent balance, the bone needles polished far beyond the requirements of utility, the fires allowed to burn low in the middle of a warm afternoon, the thousands of hours spent in the slow, repetitive work of grooming, storytelling, and play, the hundreds of plant species known and gathered without the heavy burden of the plough. These are not signs of a species struggling to survive. They are the evidence of a species that had succeeded so completely that it no longer needed to rush. From this distance, the paradox that has been growing throughout our journey finally becomes clear. We have been taught to view history as a ladder, a steady climb from the misery of the cave to the comfort of the modern city. But when we place the archaeological record alongside the reality of our modern lives, the ladder begins to look like a trade. We observe that for 300,000 years, the human day was defined by a profound abundance of time. There were no schedules because there was no need to measure what was already infinite. There was no distinction between work and life because every action, from napping a flint to sharing a meal, was a social and creative performance. This was not a local phenomenon or a brief golden age. This was the human experience across every continent and through every climatic shift, from the subarctic tundra to the tropical forests. For hundreds of thousands of years, the majority of the human day was empty of labour. And then, in a geological blink of an eye, the last 10,000 years, that emptiness vanished. When we look at the transition to agriculture from this height, we see that it was not a sudden liberation from hunger. Instead, we see the beginning of a different kind of pressure. The diverse library of wild plants was narrowed down to a few demanding grains. The unhurried movement of the group was replaced by the static, repetitive toil of the field. The unmeasured hours of the afternoon were reclaimed by the requirements of the harvest. We didn't just invent farming, we invented the concept of being busy. We traded the freedom of the day for the security of the storehouse, and in doing so we fundamentally altered the rhythm of our own minds. This transition is often viewed as the Great Fall, the moment humans left the garden of the Paleolithic and entered a cycle of labour and inequality from which we have never escaped. In this view, the progress of civilization is merely the history of us trying to work our way back to a leisure that was once our birthright. Another perspective suggests that the shift was not a mistake, but a necessary reorganization. As populations grew and the environment shifted, the slow, unhurried pace of the hunter-gatherer was no longer sustainable. We chose to work harder not because we wanted to, but because the complexity of our new world demanded it. Leisure was not stolen. It was spent to buy the survival of more people. There remains the possibility that we simply do not possess the tools to understand what time meant to a person 40,000 years ago. Perhaps the freedom we see in the archaeological record is a modern projection, and their lives were governed by social and spiritual pressures that left no trace in the soil. It may be that the most significant part of their story is the part that we can never, by definition, recover. If we stay with this image for a moment longer, we realize that the most staggering thing is not that our ancestors lived this way for so long. The staggering thing is how quickly we've forgotten that this was ever normal. We look at the ivory bird or the polished needle, and we see a curiosity from a primitive age. We rarely see them for what they actually were, the artifacts of a species that had all the time in the world. The realization settles heavily. The prehistoric world was not a landscape of terror and exhaustion. It was a world of unhurried presence, and that presence did not end because it failed. It ended because it was replaced by a new, more demanding way of being. The names, dates, and archaeological sites mentioned are not things you need to carry with you. If you are drifting into sleep, let the specific arguments go, as the core idea will remain. The story of our ancestors is not a puzzle to be solved, but a memory to be felt. Your mind can rest now, knowing the picture is finally complete, finished. We've travelled a long way through the shadows of the past, moving across vast stretches of time that existed long before the world we know was ever built. What remains with us now is not a collection of dates or a list of archaeological sites, but a sensory memory of a life that moved at a fundamentally different pace. It is the feeling of a morning that arrived without a schedule, an afternoon that offered no requirements, and an evening where the only necessity was to be present near the warmth of a steady flame. We can almost feel the weight of those empty hours, a vast unmeasured landscape of time that was once the birthright of every human being on this planet. So much of that human story has not survived to reach us. We find the durable fragments, the flint blades, the ivory carvings, and the bone needles, but these are only the skeletal remains of a much softer, more vibrant reality. The songs that echoed off limestone walls, the jokes shared during the long heat of the day, and the specific way the wind felt through a grass-thatched shelter have all returned to the earth. We're looking at a few faint traces and trying to imagine a universe that was primarily made of breath, touch, and movement. History is often a series of gaps, and we must recognize that most of what truly mattered has likely vanished into the air of the deep past. Perhaps, in the hidden parts of our own minds, we still recognize that ancient rhythm, even in a world that demands our constant attention and rewards our endless motion. There is a part of us that remembers how to simply exist. We are the same species that sat for hours watching the clouds drift across a prehistoric valley. We carry the same biology that was shaped by hundreds of thousands of years of deep leisure and unhurried connection. Somewhere beneath the pressure of our modern lives, that original balance remains, a ghost of a life that did not need to be justified by its productivity. What exactly was lost when we decided that every hour must have a purpose? When the people of the distant future look back at our own era, how will they understand our relationship with time? Will they see our constant movement as a great achievement, or will they see it as a long, exhausting departure from the rhythm that once made us whole? Now we can let these questions drift away. The narrative has reached its natural pause, and the past can return to its state of rest, There's nothing more that needs to be understood tonight, and no further distance to travel. We can simply inhabit the space that remains, letting the hours carry us forward without effort or expectation. The story can stay here while you move into the rest of your night,